मित्रों, जैसा आप जानते हैं, श्री नेमिचंद्र जैन हिंदी के प्रतिष्ठित कवि, आलोचक, रंगालोचक, संपादक और अंततः संस्था निर्माता थे। उनकी जीवन यात्रा मतलब साहित्यिक जीवन यात्रा तार सप्तक से शुरू हुई और हिंदी में उपन्यास और रंगमंच की आलोचना को ऐसा माना जाता है कि उन्हीं से शुरू मानना चाहिए, क्योंकि उन्होंने ही अधूरे साक्षात्कार और रंग दर्शन नामक 2 ग्रंथों से उपन्यास और रंगमंच को हिंदी में गंभीरता से, गहराई से, तीक्ष्णता और सूक्ष्मता से देखने की शुरुआत की। नेमी जी की दृष्टि में सिर्फ और रुचि में भी सिर्फ साहित्य और रंगमंच नहीं थे, बल्कि संस्कृति, संप्रेषण, मीडिया इत्यादि भी थे। उन्होंने मुख्यतः तो हिंदी में लिखा, पर अंग्रेजी में भी 2-3 किताबें प्रकाशित की। और माया राव के बीच संवाद भी इस किया था। इस बार हमने देश के प्रमुख समाजशास्त्रियों में से एक डॉक्टर दीपंकर गुप्त से आग्रह किया। उनको कुछ संकोच था। एक तो संकोच ये था कि ऐसी महफिल में जो ज़्यादातर साहित्य और संस्कृति के लोगों की होगी, उन जैसे समाजशास्त्री को कुछ कहना शायद इतना रुचिकर न हो। तो मैंने कुछ उनको, हमारे बुंदेलखंडी में कहते हैं, पुटे आया और कुछ कहा कि ये जो रंगकर्मी और साहित्यकार इत्यादि होते हैं, इनकी अपने क्षेत्रों के अलावा दूसरे क्षेत्रों में भी थोड़ी रुचि होती है और विचारों से भी उनको कुछ लेना देना होता है। इसलिए आप एक विचारक के रूप में अपनी बातें रखेंगे तो उनके लिए रुचिकर सिद्ध होगा। दीपंकर गुप्त दिल्ली स्कूल ऑफ इकोनॉमिक्स और जवाहरलाल नेहरू विश्वविद्यालय में पढ़ चुके हैं और पढ़ा भी चुके हैं, और उनकी बहुत सारी पुस्तकें प्रकाशित हैं, जो कि उन्होंने 30 साल जवाहरलाल नेहरू यूनिवर्सिटी में सामाजिक नेतृत्व पढ़ाया है और अब वहाँ से स्वेच्छया, आजकल कोई स्वेच्छा कहीं से सेवानिवृत्त नहीं होता, वो कैसे होगा खुदा जाने, लेकिन हो गए, क्योंकि ज़्यादातर लोगों को तो बलात् हटाना पड़ता है, तो इसलिए वो स्वेच्छा सेवानिवृत्त हो गए। उनकी बहुत सारी पुस्तकें प्रसिद्ध हैं। लर्निंग टू फॉरगेट, द एंटी मेमोयर्स ऑफ मॉडर्निटी, द केज फिनिक्स, विल इंडिया फ्लाई, एंड जस्टिस बिफोर रिकंसिलिएशन, negotiating a new normal in post-Royd Mumbai and Ahmedabad. He has been honored by the civil decoration by the government of France, Malcolm Adisheshaya Award for Development Studies, and the Eric Wohl Krishna Bharadwaj Prize for Studies on the Indian Peasantry. तो मित्रों, इसके पहले कि हम डॉक्टर दीपंकर गुप्त से अपना व्याख्यान शुरू करने को कहें। संजय जैन कृपया अध्यक्ष डॉक्टर सुरेश शर्मा और डॉक्टर दीपंकर गुप्त को फूल देने का कष्ट करें। आप लक्ष्य करेंगे कि मैंने पुष्पगुच्छ नामक अत्यंत निंदनीय शब्द का प्रोफेसर दीपंकर गुप्त को एक संकोच ये भी था कि वो इस हिंदी की महफिल में अंग्रेजी में बोलेंगे, तो इसीलिए मैंने विशेष रूप से इसका उल्लेख किया कि स्वयं नेमी जी अंग्रेजी में भी लिखते थे और इसलिए अंग्रेजी में बोलने से कोई दिक्कत नहीं है। सुरेश शर्मा वैसे तो हमारे मित्र हैं और वो भी एक समाजशास्त्री हैं, चिंतक हैं। उनसे आप में से अधिकांश लोग परिचित हैं। उनकी साहित्य में और कलाओं में गहरी रुचि रही है और वो भी अब स्वेच्छा सेवानिवृत्त होकर विश्व भ्रमण करते रहते हैं। तो ऐसी सेवानिवृत्ति बड़ी अच्छी है जो आपको विश्व भ्रमण करने का अवसर देती रहे। इसके पहले कि डॉक्टर दीपंकर गुप्त अपना व्याख्यान दें, मैं उनसे अनुरोध करता हूं कि नटरंग का ये नया अंक लोकार्पित कर दें जो अभी अभी छप कर आया है। और हम मित्रों डॉक्टर दीपंकर गुप्त।
Ashok Vajpayee, Professor Suresh Sharma, iconic artist Mr. Raza, friends, many of them very old friends. Thank you very much for coming this evening. Given the pressures of agitations on the streets and other things that are much more perhaps attractive, I'm very glad that you could make it after all. It is indeed a pleasure and very humbling too that I've been asked to present this lecture this evening. As we all know, Mr. Nemichandra Jain was a person of great eminence, and I would have liked to emulate him except for the fact that I don't have the equipment for it, and I know that only too well. I did mention that I'd have a problem speaking in Hindi and could I speak in Bengali please, and then I was told that Mr. Nemichandra Jain was an expert in Bengali language as well. He could speak several languages, Hindi, Bengali, Marathi, so there was just no way I could get out of it. He was a translator, a writer, editor, journalist. He was a polymath and a polyglot, and who wouldn't want to be like him? But I can only consign myself to being a simple admirer. I have tried to measure up to the kind of cultural standards you all have, and I mentioned it earlier that I'm a bit of a Philistine, a pigeon amongst cats, you might say, to turn the phrase around. So I've done my bit, I've tried my best, and I've called my paper The Metaphors of Culture. And there's a follow-through as well. Perhaps using a metaphor from cricket is not that good these days, but the follow-through is, the subtitle is Multiculturalism as a Way of Everyday Life. With your permission, I'll begin. Multiculturalism carries on its back an overload of willpower and political correctness. The fact, however, is that people unselfconsciously practice the principles of multiculturalism as part of their everyday lives. This becomes clear if we see cultures not as programmed entities living out their singular logic, but rather as a collection of metaphors, in which case every aspect of culture is open to multiple meanings, making negotiations over conflicting interpretations an unremarkable fact of social life. And this is what multiculturalism is actually all about. We make a huge mistake, in my view, when we look at cultures as more or less unified blocks, while occasionally admitting that a few dissenting voices do exist. It is popularly believed that a culture always speaks in one voice. Unfortunately, this point of view has not met with significant resistance even from academics and specialists whose job it is to understand culture from a theoretical point of view. Clifford Geertz, for example, in his many influential works, has favored a reading of an internally consistent culture. This is why he can look at culture as a blueprint, quote unquote, as a recipe, quote unquote, computer program, quote unquote, or even a musical score. All of these terms remind one of artifacts rather than of culture. This disposition towards culture is widespread among social anthropologists and sociologists, and indeed they are often arrived at quite independently of each other. To give a few examples, it can be discerned in Professor J.P.S. Oberoi's search for particular grammars of culture, in Louis Dumont's insistence that every Hindu abides by a single hierarchy of purity and pollution, as well as in Hofstadt's clear pronouncement, quote, "I treat culture as the collective programming of the mind which distinguishes the members of one group from another." For Pierre Bourdieu, culture is about long-standing dispositions which allow little room for dissension. This bias comes through again quite clearly in his explication of habitus. In my view, cultural membership does not arise from the subscription to a single, consistent program or grammar. On the contrary, culture is most ungrammatical in the way it functions. If anything, culture should be accessed as a collection of metaphors, and metaphors, as it is commonly acknowledged, flout the rules of grammar. Otherwise, there wouldn't be metaphors at all. By examining culture in practice in terms of metaphors, there are some clear and distinct advantages. Now at last we can entertain the possibility of communicating with one another even though there are significant disagreements. This is one aspect of my presentation that I told Professor Ashok Vajpayee about, and he seemed to think that this was worth discussing in some detail, and that is what gave me the impetus and the courage to come forward this evening. Metaphors can have a number of meanings, but to be able to recognize them, one has to be part of that world where the metaphors have been manufactured, interpreted, and known. And they must have some kind of membership in it. Without this condition in place, a metaphor or any metaphor would sound like very bad grammar and quite incomprehensible. Once we step outside the portals of grammar and enter the realm of metaphors, it becomes clear why cultures can communicate both agreement and conflict. Not just agreement, not just consensus, but agreement and conflict can both be communicated, and the only way it can be done is not through the medium of grammar, but by flouting the rules of grammar, that is through the medium of metaphors. We all know, that cultural conflicts exist even among members of a single community. You don't have to have many cultures for there to be conflict. Even within what is called a single culture, there can be different interpretations of that single culture's many metaphors. This is the stuff of everyday experience. Yet because we privileged the model of grammar over metaphor when studying culture, we lack the theoretical apparatus to recognize it. As a metaphor is polysemic, meaning has many meanings, multivocal, not all of them are in consonance with one another. They don't stand in line supporting each other. These many meanings can be quite discrete and disparate from one another. At the same time, we must take notice of Paul Ricoeur's caution that the most literal meaning of a metaphor lives in the many meanings that it might have. For example, a long arm, the long arm of the law, long arm is there. No matter how you use metaphor, that initial original literal meaning will always be present in some form or the other. Or the bull lip, These are the kinds of literal meanings that don't ever desert the many meanings of a metaphor, but they hover around like an eminence grise, giving valency to the polysemy. In other words, a metaphor can say many things, but it cannot say everything, because it is limited at the end. The parameters, the bookends of it, are the most literal meaning of the metaphor. Further, for someone to understand while disagreeing with the specific meaning of a metaphor, the person must be aware of the range of meanings that a particular metaphor allows in a particular cultural setting. If conflicting meanings of a metaphor are not understood, one can be sure that one has stepped outside a culture. This brings in the all-important aspect of membership. To know the extent or the existing polysemic variance of a metaphor requires socialization in a cultural world, which is why one's membership in it becomes so essential. For example, Melville Herskowitz has shown that there are 315 variants of the Cinderella fable, but the central story is more or less the same. This allows the metaphor of the evil stepmother, or the ugly sisters, or glass slippers to gain a number of meanings. The name Cinderella, derived as it is from cinder, evokes dirty fire chimneys and child labor in pre-modern Britain. But if a person is unacquainted with this particular fairy tale, replete with fairy godmothers and pumpkin carriages, none of these metaphors will make any sense. Or take the Ndembu puberty ritual. Ndembu is a community in Africa. The Ndembu puberty ritual, which is built around the latex tree. Latex is tree that secretes. Latex tree, which is called the Mudi tree amongst the Ndembu. At one level, the secretions from this tree symbolize motherhood and matrilineal, and women taunt men while dancing around it. That couldn't be the only time they taunt men, but that they do while this ritual is on. But this ritual gives meaning to the tension in Ndembu life that arises from the fact that they are a matrilineal people, but after marriage they live very locally. In other words, they live with their husband's family. During these dances around the muddy tree, rivalry between different lineages is also broadcast. None of that would leave an impact on an outsider who is not a member of the Ndembu tribe. When we see cultures as collections of metaphors, we are freed from searching for a unifying grammar. Often the quest for this elusive goal has led many scholars to essentialize cultures, creating stylized and typified notions of the other. Because we're looking for a consistent grammar, we're looking for meanings that do not contradict one another. We believe that cultures are homogeneous, we believe that the cultures are without any contradictions within. Therefore, we tend to essentialize and typify cultures, which makes it very difficult, amongst other things, for multiculturalism to flourish. We therefore have something called a Christian culture, Hindu culture, Islamic culture, so on. And all of these terms are really quite unreal, but what they succeed in doing is to give political ethicists a cause with which they can make trouble for all of us for a long, long time. When one allows for one's culture to be open to multiple interpretations and capable of being contested even by its members, not by outsiders, even by its members, the resistance to other traditions and peoples decreases. In popular constructions of reality, there is the urge to typify and essentialize, no doubt about that. What can be excused in the case of a lay person cannot be overlooked when it comes to the specialist. Why should sociologists and anthropologists fall victim to this rather human failing? Searching for grammars, recipe, programs, musical scores in understanding cultures is but a short step away from typifications, and typifications, as you know, are absolutely welcomed by ethnicists of all kinds all over the world. To break from the thraldom of popular constructions of reality, which involves typifications, which involves consistency within cultures, we should examine a culture for what it is in practice. This may sound inelegant, but culture is really an untidy patchwork of odds and ends, a jumble of metaphors. But through it all, It allows members to communicate even though they may have conflicting renditions of these metaphors. This is what allows for opposition to exist within cultures. We don't necessarily have to step out of it if we disagree with any particular meaning that is being espoused by somebody else who is also part of your culture. If that had been the case, cultures would have been very short-lived, incapable of providing the basis for socialization. In every culture, there are root metaphors, though their spread need not be very extensive. But what are these root metaphors? In India, one example could be that of caste. The spread of this particular metaphor, that is of caste, is more or less coterminous with what may be called Indian society in the broadest sense of the term. The metaphor of caste impacts our lives in a number of ways, but as with all metaphors, not in one consistent way. Yet behind the many interpretations of caste, there is a most literal meaning hovering, namely the distinction at birth based on purity and pollution. The other root metaphors in India could be that of Mother India, or the partition, or Parda, the joint family, and the list can be easily enlarged. A moment's reflection will show that the passions evoked by these root metaphors are not consistent with one another either. There is no grammatical or elective affinity between, say, partition, caste, joint family, or Parda. Yet each of these metaphors are capable of arousing passion that readies people to kill, and sometimes, though rarely, to be killed. It is the existence of such high-powered metaphors that usually delimit one society from another society in a number of obvious ways. All these metaphors, though they are widely known and effective in their spread, are not only open to many interpretations, but there can be serious disagreements between one meaning and another. Yet, as these meanings can be communicated and comprehended, in spite of disagreement, vivifies the notion of cultural membership. There are indeed levels of root metaphors. The zone within which one root metaphor is active may be called an encultured space. Some have a limited spatial significance, while others have a wider appeal. It is the last, the one with the wider appeal, that often posts the outer boundaries of a culture without denying the existence of lower-level root metaphors. Once these more general metaphors make little sense, nor impact everyday life, we can be fairly sure that we have crossed cultural boundaries. Yet, as those who consider these metaphors to be significant also subscribe to these others that are present on a grander scale, such as caste, partition, Mother India, and so on, it can be assumed that membership to the latter subsumes the former. Remember, no agreement on any metaphorical interpretation exists, yet the discordant voices are comprehended and communicated. The greater the number of conflicting opinions, the stronger the hold of a metaphor among the interpreting members of the community. Culture imposes membership. People belong to a community because they are all in the know. As we mentioned earlier, some root metaphors have a more restricted zone of membership. These may be regnant or dominant only in a certain part of the society and appear quite meaningless outside it, even in neighboring regions. For example, Shivaji Maharaj in Maharashtra, Rabindranath Tagore in Bengal, and Raj Karega Khalsa among Sikhs are not powerful really outside the specific cultural spaces. Some believe that Raj Karega Khalsa implies that Sikhs shall rule, and others interpret the same line to mean that truth shall rule. Marxism too can become a metaphor, and unbelievably, Maulana Maududi, in fact, viewed it positively for some time in pre-partition India, because he saw in Marxism a superior organizational spirit in the idea of the vanguard of the proletariat. On account of metaphors being active at different levels, the meaning that any one of them can generate and become regnant depends entirely on the context. We could imagine the metaphor of Mother India in a school assembly where obedience and homework matter, but we could also see it come up in jingoistic expressions of nationalism where one community is pitted against another community. The Shiv Sena used Mother India in the late 1960s to show how unpatriotic the DMK was. In recent times, Anna Hazare has resorted to this metaphor to fight corruption. In all these instances, again, multiple and conflicting interpretations are possible. The metaphorical usages of Chhatrapati Shivaji is also context dependent. Shiv Sena employed it first to attack South Indians, then the communists, and finally the Muslims. The Samyukta Maharashtra Samiti also deployed the same metaphor, but to seek greater voice for rural Maharashtrians in the running of the state. Likewise, Tagore too has been put to a number of purposes, from nationalism to rationalism to Bengali chauvinism. Some may use this metaphor in all these contexts, but allow it to flourish only in certain very limited zones. Through all of this, as metaphors are metaphors, some of these meanings cross religious boundaries and scale linguistic walls. Hence, cultural negotiations through metaphors are going on all the time across very tricky terrain. If wars, migration, and pestilence create cataclysmic upheavals, some of these metaphors take on new, regnant meanings. For example, the metaphor of America being God's own country has in some renditions been blanched or cleansed of its Christian content. This would have seemed impossible some decades back, but America is still seen by many people of different faiths to be the chosen land. It would perhaps be helpful in our consideration of culture as metaphors to discuss at length the metaphor of caste. This would provide a fitting illustration of the argument. Caste is without question a pan-Indian phenomenon, but it has other features also that recommend it this evening. Its origins are clouded in tradition, its practice today fraught with politics, and its relevance to everyday life continues in the context of marriage and other rites of passage. Caste is popularly understood in terms of a hierarchy of purity and pollution. This may be a lay person's perception, but has done well because it has received academic support over a long period of time. The most acknowledged scholar who espoused this position, of course, was the famous Louis Dumont. Dumont began his treatise on caste by first clarifying what he thought was a true hierarchy. According to him, a hierarchical relation is that between larger and the smaller, or more precisely between that which encompasses and that which is encompassed. In the case of caste, the decisive step is accomplished once a quality, like impurity, is attributed in a permanent manner to certain people, namely the so-called untouchables. To cap it all, to quote, the caste system is a state of mind, unquote, which provides the orientation towards the whole. So this state of mind singularly and consistently provides the orientation towards the whole through various situations and among different orders. Now this hierarchy is so pure that it does not admit power as a significant variable. If power does come up, it does so surreptitiously, making itself the equalist of status at the interstitial levels in between, but never really bothers caste as an entity on the whole. Well, enough of quotations. Let us inspect what such a hierarchical understanding of caste implies. First, it is not a depiction of a metaphor, but a description of a unique pattern. As Dumont and legion of other thinkers argue, caste is a state of mind and is expressed uniformly in various situations, such that power considerations are not permitted, and if such a thing ever enters the picture, it is always on the margins. This allows caste to function as a pure state of mind, untouched by real-world considerations of economics and politics. As the hierarchy has to be complete, the pure must also have at its other pole the absolute impure, namely the untouchables. There is nothing metaphorical about this presentation. It is first a description, second an inflexible one, as it is universally abided to by every Hindu. This makes subservience to the caste hierarchy complete. In keeping with this position, Michael Moffat and the well-known anthropologists argued that the untouchables actually participate willingly in their own oppression and in their own subjugation. So complete is the hold of the caste ideology on the Hindus. As we can see, in the best demonstration of caste as hierarchy, there is very little room for conflict over interpretations. Everything is given, the state of mind at absolute rest, and the purity pollution hierarchy firmly pinned to the wall. Thus, whether one is high caste or low, the observance of caste is without contradictions. Once we change the angle of vision a little and look at caste as a metaphor, a new cultural world opens up. In place of one hierarchy, what we find are several hierarchies, most of them in open or covert opposition with one another. Herbert Risley tells us about a chamar, quote unquote, chamar origin tale. This is a term he used in his work, which is 19th century, where these people of this background claim that they were once Brahmins, but were let down by other vile Brahmins who were their brothers and kinsfolk. But the story goes somewhat like this. 3 brothers were going for a bath in the morning to the Ganges, and on the way they saw a cow struggling in quicksand, daldal, quicksand. So the 2 elder brothers turned to the youngest brother and said, well, there's that cow, why don't you go and rescue it? So the younger brother, duty is duty, goes forward and manfully wrestles with the cow, but then he comes back to his brothers and sorrowfully reports that the cow is dead. Upon which the brothers turn on him and say, you have touched a carcass, from now on you're a chamar. So you see, the origin of chamar is not because they are lowly actually, but because they've been fooled and cheated by deceitful brothers. The Kayasthas of Bengal think that Brahmins are inferior, just about good enough to be their cooks. The Chandals too dispute their low status, and as if to make a point, they argue that Shraddha ceremony should be observed on the 11th day as it is for Brahmins. The Vishwakarma community that comprises braziers, carpenters, masons and blacksmiths believe that they are notch above Brahmins. In keeping with this lofty caste name that they bear, they claim to be direct descendants of God. The Navis or barbers of the Mumbai region once believed that they were born of the serpent Sesha that curled around Shiva's neck and was told to assume a human form. Wealthy herdsmen in South India call themselves Pillai, thereby invoking the Virala model and rejecting the Brahmanical one. The Vaivancha Barots of Gujarat once said they were Kshatriyas but later chose to be Banyas. This was consequent upon the fact that princely families had been downgraded in North Gujarat and the merchant community had been elevated in everyday aspects in those societies. Far from accepting the impure status and participating in their own oppression, as I said earlier, according to Moffat, we find the so-called untouchables everywhere putting up a strong resistance to the imputed low status. There's another fable, or origin tale rather, what they call Jati Puranas, which says that there was a conference of the gods, and Shiva, of course, was at the head, and Parvati was serving them drinks and refreshment, where suddenly, in the middle of it all, quite infelicitously, Parvati gave birth to 3 children, and she was hugely embarrassed. So she hid one in the tamarind jar, one in the toddy jar, and one in the betel nut jar, and that's how they got their caste names. They are actually children of the gods. There's another story, Shiva comes up in many of these origin tales. Another one where the washerwoman, this is the Chasha Dhoba story from Bengal, the washerwoman sends her son to Shiva to take his soiled clothes and wash them. And the son comes there, the little boy comes there and knocks at the door, and Parvati opens the door and says, well, you come for his clothes, okay, just wait. She goes in and finds that Shiva is in meditation, deep meditation, and doesn't come out of it. When he comes out of it, Parvati scolds him for being irresponsible and says, there's a little boy out there waiting for your clothes. So Shiva steps out and there's no boy. And as all of you know, and there's Ashish goes there who knows too well in so many of his theatres and plays, that Shiva lives in a very dangerous place. There are all kinds of ogres, trolls, child lifters, man-eaters who live there. And so the Shiva thought that, maybe the child has been picked up. What will I tell his mother? But as Shiva is Shiva, he can do anything. He created a likeness of the child. But what really happened is that boys will be boys, and that boy went home. Now there was one boy too many. And therefore, from this other boy who was a creation of Shiva comes the so-called Chashadhoba. The Navis of Bombay say that they are born from the neck of serpent Shesha. And as I told you that there's the other tale of I haven't told you this is about the Domes who believe that their ancestor was a very ascetic person, highly rarefied, ancestor, whose life was so exemplary that even the gods danced his attendance upon him, trying to pick up tips on what it is to lead a good life. And naturally he invoked a lot of jealousy from people around, and they tricked him one day into eating the wrong kind of food, the wrong kind of people. The gods saw him, and therefore he was demoted. But actually, we belong, the Domes say, to a very elevated family background, and we don't deserve to be looked down upon as you people often do. The cobblers of Maharashtra once believed that they were Rajputs by descent. The leather workers amongst the Sikh community now claim an Adi status. They are called Ad-Dharmis. The Sikh, once upon a time, they were the leather workers. And they claim Adi status, Adi, as do the Jajagara Kamaras and the Merada Kamaras, blacksmiths by occupation. Incidentally, the use of the term Adi here signifies that their culture and traditions predate and surpass the Vedic ones to which the Brahmins and other twice born adhere. So they are in a sense the motherboard from which all these other cultures have emerged. This term has been borrowed extensively since Jyotiba Phule first employed it to herald the non-Brahmin movement that he led in Maharashtra's 19th century. It is true that nobody wants to be known as a Shudra or as an untouchable, and this is hardly extraordinary. Even a cursory exercise in phenomenological intersubjectivity will demonstrate this quite readily. Yet this comes as a surprise to many who believe with Dumont and Moffat that lower caste acquiesced willingly into the orthodox hierarchy. As we have found, this is far from true. They contest the hierarchy and put forward their own, though much of it remained concealed for a long time. I must tell you how I first came upon this particular phenomenon, because I was schooled in the proper anthropological tradition where I was told that there's one caste, one hierarchy, and we all better believe in it. When I was in Gujarat many years ago, I had to do some field work, and as you know, most of us don't mind doing field work, but we don't want to get dysentery and diarrhea and so forth. So I had I hired a woman who was going to cook for me, boil water for me, and she was supposed to be a member of the Dubla community in Gujarat, which is sort of scheduled tribe, scheduled caste, nobody's very sure. So I got to know her well over a period of time. We became quite friendly. And one day she told me that she's not really a Dubla at all, but she belongs to a proud clan of the Rajput Rathors. And I said, but this is rubbish. You were introduced as a Dubla, you said you were a Dubla. Where did Rajput Rathor come from? So then she said that this entire place, South Gujarat, was under the control of her ancestor. He was a very nice man, very powerful, very generous king, and he took under his umbrella, under his wing, a person of lower caste background. Note the way it was put to me. Now this man then stabbed his benefactor in the back, literally, usurped the throne, and suppressed all his descendants. That is why they are known as Dublas today. But one day they will claim their spot in the sun, and you will recognize them for what they actually are. So what is being said here is that I am not low caste, but those upper caste people are actually low caste. So watch out for them. So you see, within the idea of caste, there's so many interpretations, counter-interpretations, and yet those who don't agree with my interpretation nevertheless understand what I'm saying and of course disapprove of it. In traditional societies, the poorer castes dared not express who they thought they really were, because they knew that would invite the wrath of the superior classes. So when people went to the villages to look at the caste order, why is it that nobody talked about this? Why is it this escaped their attention? Why is it that no anthropologist or sociologist of contemporary times even looked at the extant available literature of Enthoven, Risley, Hunter, which were there in the libraries? and which documented in great detail the number of Jati Puranas that were known. Why didn't people pay attention to it? For a long time they didn't pay attention to it because they were completely enamored with this single hierarchy, because this was so unique, so so culturally exotic and so marketable in the foreign world. Also, I think people of the so-called lower caste, like this woman who told me the story about her background, even then, even as late as the late 1970s, she spoke of it in hushed tones. I of course thought she was quite mad then, and I went to a village and there I met her children, her grandchildren, her sons-in-law, and I was surprised that everybody told me the same story. From then on, whenever I go on field trips, I always ask two questions. One concerns the nation state, which doesn't bother us here. The other is where I ask so-called lower caste people about their caste origin tales. And believe me, you must believe me, in 100% cases, not one person of the so-called lower caste has ever said that I deserve to be where I am, my blood is bad, my bones are impure, my substances are terrible. Not one. All of them have claimed either descent from the gods, or from Brahmins, or from Kshatriyas, and as I found, also from the Vaishyas. But it's true, nobody wants to be a Shudra. Who wants to be a Shudra? But if they were to make these claims openly in those days, then they would immediately attract the attention of the superior castes, the landowning caste, the oligarchy, and that wouldn't be good at all. As recent as 1953, a Jat boy was getting married in Rajasthan, and he thought he'd go to his bride's house in Rajput style. So he sat on a horse, he wore a sword and a turban and a pair of shoes. He curled his mustaches upwards, and he was going through this forest. He was accosted by 10 or 11 Rajput boys who said, "How dare you pretend to be a Rajput," and shot them dead. This is 53. You can't do it today. There's no question. In fact, you have chief ministers who are Jats in Rajasthan. It's impossible. But the fact is, for a long time, people believed in a certain version of who they actually were, but were never able to express it for fear of oppression from those communities who were around them and ruling over them. But things have changed in modern times. From the closing years of the 19th century, and more stridently later, communities who were for generations considered untouchables are fighting back. Gone is the overt submission, and with embracing the term Dalit, they have signaled their open revolt to the orthodoxy and to the single hierarchy. It is true that much of this was possible because the whole of the erstwhile landed class has declined after independence. This does not take away from the fact that had not this symbolic resistance been lying in wait among the oppressed castes as a whole, all this while their political expression would not have come up ever. It was always there, submerged, ready to come out, given the opportunity. The energies were there, the alternative hierarchies were active in their minds, and all it needed was a new social arrangement to bring them out. With the advance of literacy, many castes that were once considered depressed and even polluting had been able to propagate alternative hierarchies through publications of books and pamphlets. The Kurichan of Malabar, they did this very effectively. Eravas did it too, as you all know. But some of you may not know the Kurichan story. The Kurichan story is as follows. They believe that they are superior to everybody else, like so natural. But they also felt that if they get up in the morning and the first thing they see is a Brahmin, they will come back home, wash their eyes, and hope for the best the second time around. And if a Brahmin were to enter their homes, then they replaster their homes with cow dung paste in order to purify it from that inauspicious visit. So the idea that the lower caste, so-called lower caste, always believe that they are low is completely false. And there are many tales, many origin tales, and many actual lives, and many protest movements that will make this known quite easily. With the advance of literacy, many castes that were once considered depressed and even polluting had been able to propagate alternative hierarchies. The suppressed regnant meanings or ruling meanings of the metaphor of hierarchy are now out in the open. Nobody says that caste is wrong. What they're saying is, my positioning in the caste order is not right. That man says, I'm not an untouchable, but that man deserves to be an untouchable. They're not against untouchability, but against their position as an untouchable. Well, some may not like what they say, but that does not mean that they do not comprehend them. It's only because they can figure out the meanings too well that counterclaims and actions are often plotted across the caste order. The full story of multiple readings of hierarchy would be incomplete without stressing in bold that caste offers many models for emulation. It is often uncritically assumed that everybody admires a Brahmin. This is far from true, as I just told you. I give you the Kurichal story. Now, if you were to go to the Sonars, for example, they will not take food from a Brahmin. They think the Brahmin is not good enough. Incidentally, as we live in Delhi, you just step out a few miles and you meet a Jat farmer and you tell the Jat farmer, do you know a Brahmin is superior to you? He'll look at you incredulously. He'll think it's a joke, a bad joke. They'll say, a Brahmin superior to me? Why, that fat, oily, unctuous, rice-eating man? How can he be superior to me? You know, I'm a Jat and I look so good. The Kshatriya model of emulation is perhaps most resorted to today than any other. Nearly all peasant castes believe they are from the warrior Varna, with the probable exception of the Anavils of Gujarat, the Jhas of Darbhanga, the Tyagis of Uttar Pradesh, who consider themselves to be Brahmins. Among others, Nicholas Dirks and Delkin Quigley have in recent times brought to our notice the supremacy of the king over the priest in temple rituals. Forget everything else, even in temple rituals. In doing this, they reminded us, of course, of the earlier contributions of Hogarth. Through the works of such scholars, we realize that the caste system as a whole was ordered in relation to the king. No wonder the Kshatriya model is so persuasive and dominant peasant castes find it most suitable to their stature. Here, once again, there are disputes. Again, just go step outside Delhi, as between the Jats and the Gurjars, as to who is a real warrior. Which caste has traditionally shown greater valor in the face of the enemy? The Gurjars think they did, the Jats think they did. Who gave it to Muslims first? That's the question the Gurjars ask. Who gave it to the British first? That's the question the Jats ask. And the interpretation of metaphors goes on and on and on. Nor should one take the Bania model lightly. With a name like mine, you might think I'm a Bania. I wish I were, but I'm a poor Bengali and not a rich merchant. As we mentioned earlier, the Vaivancha Baros chose the merchants as templates for emulation, giving up their Kshatriya preference. The Vaivancha Baros are bards, traditional bards. These are the people that rich landlords hired to make out their genealogies. And if you had enough money, then they'd make it out in verse. If you had more money, they'd sing it out. And these were traditional bards or genealogists, professional genealogists. And their patrons were generally the princes of Saurashtra and northern Gujarat. And because the patrons were princes and Kshatriyas, the Vaivancha Baros said that we are Kshatriyas too. And because they're bards, they had a great time in making up their own genealogies, and there were thick tomes of literature, and they were lined with them. But then times changed, and the princes were no longer as they were cut out to be in the past, and up come the Kapol Banias, who are much better off. So now they want to switch sides and become Kapol Banias. The only problem is that they're weighted down by all the literature that they themselves had produced about themselves, claiming to be Kshatriyas. According to Gupta and Bhaskar, Samadhu Gupta by the way, and Bhaskar, the kings of Ayodhya, Mathura and Koshambi were Vaishyas. They even believed that the Gupta kingdom was a Vaishya one. The Subarna Banis of Bengal claimed superiority over all other castes as they walked on fire with goddess Anayaka. The Subarna Banis, by the way, believe that they're superior to all other castes in Bengal because they say that we are light-skinned people. And Bengalis are not exactly light-skinned, so they are jealous of us. And because they're jealous of us, therefore Baldol Shen, one 11th century king of Bengal, demoted them from their proper position to what they are now, which is the Vaishya community. Lawrence Allen Babb has perhaps given us the most detailed study of Vaishya or Bania pride. He argues that while the Khandelwals claim a Rajput ancestry, they turned their backs on Kshatriya way of life as they were repelled by animal sacrifice. They not only reject the Kshatriya model, but positively abhor it. The Agarwals do not claim a Kshatriya status at all, not even remotely. The Agroha Vikas Trust and Bharatendu Harishchandra, the famous Agarwal poet, have consistently claimed that merchants of banyas are proud Vaishyas. If cultures were like grammar, a musical score, I'm going back to my earlier point, or a computer program, it would have been impossible to get a grip on the multiple interpretations of the caste hierarchy. The fact that it took so long to accomplish this is not because a fresh set of facts suddenly came to light. The facts were always there. But because we always saw culture as grammar and not as metaphor, and we looked for consistency when there was none. As a result, we downgraded the continuous need to negotiate within a culture. All cultures need negotiations all the time because of multiple interpretations over the metaphors that constitute a particular culture. It is not as if cultural resolutions are always unanimous, yet there is communication across disputed meanings. That we can achieve this is because culture imposes a membership of those who can interpret and understand regnant or ruling meanings of a metaphor even while they disagree with them. This is why metaphors necessitate membership and cultures generate partisanship. You can die for it. And multiculturalism would do well to plug into this rather than boast that as a separate ethic. Everyday culture has never been an everyday affair. Confucius supposedly said that, quote, a common man marvels at uncommon things, a wise man marvels at the commonplace, unquote. Looked at this way, multiculturalism does not appear to be too much of a recent innovation. That it did appear that way for many is because of the long-held view that cultures were internally consonant in tradition and hence could be observed unproblematically. Remember Dumont and Moffat, what they said about the lower caste? But now that the world has changed, multiculturalists would insist we need a different set of manners. We must learn to negotiate with cultures as we now have new neighbors in the block. In other words, multiculturalism is positioned as a special effort introduced by political correctness and a must-do for democracy if it is to survive in today's mobile world. In such renditions, or even cognate ones, cultures are seen as if they were once in orderly furrows, in orderly lines, till contemporary events place them amidst alien corn. Multiculturalism, valued though it is, comes as an additional burden, a yoke for modern times. In fact, the logic of multiculturalism is actually embedded in everyday cultural practice, as I just mentioned. As we are in any case, with or without multiculturalism, negotiating between different interpretations of the many metaphors inside a culture, this logic is not new. Multiculturalism today is fired by the same principle. Yes, contemporary events bring other cultures that have historically been apart closer to us. But our own has always been problematic from the start. That we negotiate within needs only to be enlarged to condition the way we negotiate with other cultures. Once we see the similarity, multiculturalism is not that much of a novelty anymore. In fairness, while cultural negotiations have always existed, they work best in a democracy. After all is said and done, peace was patrolled in the past, guarded, chowkidari in the past, both between cultures and within cultures on the basis of power in the past, in medieval times. Medieval peace was of that sort. The victors set the parameters for the vanquished. The more potent and influential set the parameters for the less potent and the less influential. Multiculturalism in a democracy lifts negotiated peace above these considerations by the establishment of a universal law. But remember, always remember, that this universal law requires a lot of patrolling too. Thank you.
I would like to know क्या परंपराएं सवाल दिए जाते हैं स्मृति व्याख्यान में.
So now it's open to questions or
comments which should be brief and sorry. Some of them can be in agreement as well.
We are very much concentrated on the caste system. But as we consider now from our own interpretations, caste system and the four religions in India are integrated with each other as some kind of ashram system and varna system. These two systems, varna system and ashram system, cannot be separated. It is varna ashram. And varna ashrama does not apply to the ladies, to the female gender. To them, we have vitakshara. So, 50% of the population is already free from the caste system because of vitakshara. And 50% remains, and that is the political system. What we call religion is actually politics. And what in the Western context they call their political doctrines is actually their religion. So, Brahmin is the intellectual imperialist, Kshatriya is the welfare fascist, Vaishya is the free trade democrat, Shudra is the Marxist socialist. We are perennial classes, and there is no fifth class. So, how you can interpret?
But even another version of I don't agree with you on Vitakshara at all. I think Vitakshara does not separate the way you say it. In fact, Vitakshara gives the unborn child a status that was not given in the Theravada system. But I think in addition, what we must also pay attention to is that women are supposed to be the guardians of purity in the orthodox understanding of caste. They're not outside it. That is why you will find that if a woman is quote unquote going astray, the family is very worried. And you will also notice that the treatment of widows, the way it was treated, is to a large extent conditioned by the fact that women are supposed to be the guardians of the receptacles of honor and purity within a caste. Now, of course, all of that can be disputed, and they have been disputed. You have some very interesting studies today which tell us about the alternative role that women played within the system in a place like, say, Bengal. And this includes not just women from zamindari families, also women who were prostitutes, dancing girls, and theatre personalities, and real powerful intellectuals. So you have all that happening. So I don't think women were ever outside, in practice, outside the caste system. But of course could be some madcap, interpreter who say they are, but they never were, not in practice.
Culturality actually lies in the seeds. Now, if you were to think of India, let's say, as compared to Europe, so how would you really distinguish? What would be your way of distinguishing these two cultures? Is it the range of metaphors that is available, the kinds of metaphors and the range of metaphors that exists in India and Europe, or the focus of those metaphors, what those metaphors are about, that distinguish, so to speak, different cultures. I mean, what we call in everyday language different cultures. What really distinguishes them?
Yeah, it's a very good question and a tricky one too. Because you see, India, we call India India. There's a political, consideration behind it. But Dr. Parsons had once said, and I say it very well, that a society is a bounded space within which there is an adequate amount of self-sufficiency. What he meant by this was simply this, that should there be invasions or should there be no truck with the outside community, this society could reproduce itself. Now, the boundaries of this self-sufficiency have over time, and this is the contribution of history, have over time grown. In the past, you could think of small communities which were societies because they were self-sufficient in their own way, though the boundaries are porous, except for occasional relationship or shall we say war or feasting, they didn't have much to do with one another. This to a certain extent is also to be seen in the way in which America describes the native people in terms of nations, because they were actually strong societies. Now, when you look at different societies nowadays, I think the political aspect cannot be overlooked, because that has also played into the meanings of metaphors. For example, in India and Pakistan, we have so many things in common, and yet today there are great differences, because 65 years have made a difference. So certain metaphors don't mean anything at all over there, and they mean a lot over here. For example, partition means something quite different over there and quite different here. If someone were to go to Pakistan and read about partition, they'd think it was a completely strange animal, not the one that they're aware of in this country. So politics also plays a role. Europe is not just Europe. Europe is, of course, also many societies. You have, for example, France. One of the most important things of France politically, which has made the distinction and allowed for multiple interpreted metaphors within, is the way in which, from, I would say, in my own view, 1906, the French downgraded the role of the Pope and said that you will not wear any publicly, you will not wear any sign of religion, the cross or whatever, and that was against the Christian Church, against the Catholic Church, against themselves. So today, in the discussions on the hijab and so forth, the French people have a different point of view than essentially the Spanish and the Italians. They say that we are against religious demonstration of symbols because we did it to ourselves first, and they claim therefore a certain kind of moral superiority that the French and the Spanish and the Italians cannot claim. So politics also plays a certain role, and over time politics, I think, begins to influence the range and role of metaphors and the various meanings given to them. So sometimes the idea of why should the hijab be a problem in France is actually quite incomprehensible to most other Europeans. They don't see the point at all. The British don't see it at all. But from the French point of view, they say, yes, we are very strong about this, we want to stand by it, because not only do we think all gods are crazy, but we think our gods are the craziest. You see? And we began with our own God. So that is the way I think, different cultures over time form this boundary of self-sufficiency within which certain cultures, certain metaphors of certain cultures become regnant, whose meanings are known and interpreted even while they are disagreed.
So in maybe Europe is too big a space, but what we normally refer to as Western civilization.
Well, let's take something like the notion of who is a cultured person, a literate person, and a person of culture. The person of culture would differ a great deal in terms of its very many meaning between the French and the British. So, in Britain, for example, if you were to say that you've read a lot of books, it doesn't mean very much. What really matters is how you speak English, how you hold a coffee cup, and how you eat a cucumber sandwich. Whereas in France, this, as Bourdieu himself said, one part of Bourdieu alive, he talked about embodied culture. What kind of books do you have in your library? Do you know Molière? Can you recite Racine backwards? And all this is because of the Third Republic and the difference it made. Third Republic let loose upon France a whole army of what they call hussards noirs, soldiers in black. These were intellectuals, and some of them were very well-known intellectuals, Durkheim, Lévi-Strauss, and so forth, who wore black suits and black ties and went across the length and breadth of France, teaching one curriculum and one language. France, remember, when it became independent, revolution time, 17% spoke French. By the time it was 1906, 100% spoke French with different accents, of course. And it was 4 o'clock, they're all doing Voltaire. 3 o'clock, Racine. 2 o'clock, Molière, across France. So you see, that has made a difference. Whereas in Britain, you had a different sort of education. So regular meanings of what is it to be an elite, person of merit, things that I saw. Or what is it to be a Christian? Even that. What does it mean to go to a church? All of these things are in some ways conditioned by the political culture of the time.
Culture is something which I really like, but at the same time, some questions crop up, like say the institutionalization of culture. To an extent perhaps is useful, and to an extent it's disturbance also, like say university disciplines or say Sangeet Natak Academy, where music is defined in a certain way, culture is what about the cultural practices? What is relation between this and the institutionalization of culture on the one hand? On the other, we find certain workings in the social norms, and in certain times certain symbols somehow get the imagination and power and is galvanized as a concept and then takes up the public space. So there's a whole lot of tension between these two extremes, and I'm really perplexed how it can be explained or understood.
I'll try my best. For me, institution is not just Sangeet Kala Akademi or Lalit Akademi. Institutions are for people like, let's just say from a sociological point of view, are repetitive practices that happen over generations and that condition to a certain extent the kind of behavior responses you might expect from other people. It won't always happen that way, but you can have a set of possible responses to a certain situation. So you enter a classroom, you know that the student will be sitting a certain way, you're supposed to stand somewhere. There will be differences of course in classroom and classroom, but there's certain broad parameters which are built on repetitive behavior that make for an institution. It is not concrete, mortar, stone, chairman, etc., make institutions. It is repetitive behavior that make institutions. The second point is that there are some things like business practices, organizational rules, and things of the sort. They are not really culture. Why? Because in these statements or documents, the various aspects of it, the constituent elements of a business program, or of a working, or of an organizational chart, they all stand in line supporting each other. They're all self-supporting. You can't have a business document where one element may contribute to another element. The best business document, I spent about many years in the business world, the best business documents are those that are consistent, internally consistent. And you keep enlarging upon it, almost like expanding on a tautology. You know, you keep expanding on what is there. You say, for example, individualism in business means the manager taking risks. What does it mean if the manager takes risks? The manager is also trying to get the best out of his or her team. So all of these things are consistent internally. Whereas in cultures, I'm trying to tell you, metaphors don't stand in line. Metaphors are not consistent with one another. They just happen to be together, and everybody understands what is being said when multiple interpretations are broadcast. Then the third point, which is a very tricky one, and that is this. That there are certain things, I can't answer the entire gamut of the third point you raised, because I don't know too much about it, as if I know too much about anything. But in this particular case, I can say this much. There are certain practices come up, certain arts come up. I won't call them culture, call them arts come up, in a certain cultural background. Let's take Bharatanatyam for example. Bharatanatyam came up in a certain cultural background, in an encultured space. Who was dancing, what were the reasons for dancing, who danced, who was the audience, etc. Kanchipuram saris again. You know, this is, you might say it's an artifact, but it had a cultural resonance about it. Now I can take the Bharatanatyam out of its original cultural space, the Kanchipuram sari out of the original cultural space, and then they don't continue to be have the same cultural gravitas as they had earlier, and now they only appear as objects or as artifacts. And that is also something we must pay attention to, which is why I think today a large number of people are trying to return artifacts to culture. You know, something that artifacts had lost. And this is a stress, I think, in some very advanced and refined artists and literatures in our country and elsewhere.
I feel extremely privileged to be here at this memorial lecture. It's been a very rewarding, stimulating experience listening to Professor Dipankar Gupta. I would just like to make two remarks. And I say this because I think it's very interesting, it's very significant that Dipankar Gupta chooses to speak of culture, which itself is a kind of a formative form, a metaform, through a linguistic form which, whenever it speaks significantly, speaks beyond itself. Its ability to speak significantly rests precisely on this capacity to be able to speak beyond itself. Now, the itselfness of its form clings, it doesn't disappear. And that was something marked out very, very sharply and in prescient detail by Dipankar Gupta. In marking out the relationship between metaphor and meaning, there is of course this dimension which was sketched and it made accessible to us in its dense and vast complexity. That is the dimension of politics, the social context itself. But is there something in the nature of metaphor which makes access to meaning available and possible beyond the context? Surely it must be so, because without that, the very idea of metaphor as a meaningful linguistic form, I think, would cease to exist. And what is it that makes, what is it that from whence that becomes possible and accessible? In the strictest limits of cultural frames, I will mention three incidents and include when Christ invokes the metaphor of sin to say, let someone who has not sinned cast the first stone. It is within the frame, within the sociological, cultural frame, the ability to reach out to something which is absolutely beyond itself. Take for instance Confucius, the great enunciator of the idea of filial piety. Here was a man who had inculcated self-restraint on the grandest possible scale. And it is said about him that when his son died, he said farewell with a lot of flowers and just a few tears. But when his favorite student, and this is in a tradition where the merit of having a son as the bearer of virtue is so central to the Confucian ethos. When his favorite student died, for the first time in his life, he broke down and said, have the heavens turned against me? This I want to thank Professor Dipankar Gupta, all the people present here, those who participated, the Nimchan Nidhi, and thank Professor Dipankar for a very, very rewarding 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
So friends, you will agree that we have a brilliant lecture, and we are very grateful on behalf of Nimi Nidhi and Natarang Pratishthan to Professor Deepak Gupta for having taken the trouble, and to Suresh Sharma for having presided over it, and for all of you who came here in spite of the difficulties today. Thank you very much.